society runs a journal, the Cambridge Journal of Science and Policy. It's in our second year. It is peer reviewed, it is open source, it is triple blind. It's pretty good. We accept lots of different articles of different lengths. There are many more details on our website, or following the links below. You can find links on Facebook. Do email us if you can't find something, you want to find something. The crucial point is papers. If you have anything interesting to say about science policy in general, please do write to us and write something and submit it. You've got a good chance of being published, though of course it is under peer review. The journal also will each time will have a few entries from very distinguished members of academia, government, science policy, so it's worth a read even if you don't submit something. But I just wanted to draw your attention to that. The deadline is at the end of January, so Christmas might be a good time to get to writing something. And our second advert of the evening, tomorrow I think is the final lecture of the CUSPE term. This is a workshop with Professor Jonathan Grant, a similar sort of topics, but really focused on the here and now of COVID. What can we learn about how science is being funded and the way scientific advice is being given? Do sign up and go along. The Eventbrite thing is at the bottom, but we can put that in the chat as well. Very easy to, and I think a great event as well. That's all from me, I'm happy to say. And it's my privilege to hand over to Dr. Van Woensel. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction, and Martin and Jane for the organization. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to see some familiar faces in the public. So as Richard already said, I'm working at the European Parliament, where I'm as a foresight expert heading the Scientific Foresight Service. So our team monitors techno-scientific trends and makes publications for the members of Parliament with a science policy analysis. So really in the middle of your business, because it seems that Cambridge is very active in the area of science and policy. It's namely the second time that I'm invited in this group. The last time was when I was working in Oxford, 2017, 2018. So what is my background, because this can be relevant for the second part of the program, is I have obtained my master in physics at the University of Leuven, so one of the other great universities in Europe. I've done my research partly conducted at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands for my PhD. I was following, even in the ages ago, a study on climatology before we knew if the Earth was going to warm or not. I have studied business administration also at the KU Leuven. Afterwards, I studied, when I was still already working, music technology at Open University UK. So I think Open University comes back in a lot of CVs of people everywhere. And I did also some specific studies, such as on strategic use of social media via Open University UK. And then I had an intensive training on scenario-based foresight in the Saïd Business School in Oxford. Basically, what my dream was as a kid was, as a girl, was to become an astronaut and even to be the first woman to go to the moon. But anyway, I stayed with my feet on the ground. So, and I'm working now in the Parliament, and my current trainee, Marcos Fernandez, is attending here. Unfortunately, the traineeships applications closed 2 days ago for the next term, but there will be new trainee applications open in half a year. I have, the last thing I did except working in the Parliament was a fellowship which I had at University of Oxford. And this is when I had some time to do research on bias of evidence. And this became one chapter of the book I wrote afterwards. One chapter on bias and responsible policymaking, but the book is more broad over foresight-based scientific advice. And this will be, so in my presentation, but I better can start it, I explain ways of responsible responsible scientific advice for policy making, with a small focus on bias, but of course you can ask questions after the main part of the presentation before we go to how does the profile of a scientific advisor look like, because I understood you are all keen on going to celebrate that the lockdown is ended, at least in Cambridge, not here. So I will try to share my PowerPoint, and I hope everything goes well. Share. Do you see my slide?
Yes, I do.
I don't see mine yet. Voila, yes, I get the same screen then as you. So thank you all for being here, because scientific advice for policymaking is maybe not the most evident for an average university student. Basically, I focused the session on a trustworthy foresight-based policy analysis. So foresight is a buzzword which come everywhere, but you will understand the main principles of foresight after this. So it's always good to know who's your audience, and therefore I Googled again the CUSPE, and I found a very interesting sentence in your mission, namely that the society strives to support young scientists who wish to influence policy from within the research environment. And influencing can be also manipulating. So this is where biases anyway will come in, and also from the research environment. So if you look into scientific advice purely from a scientific point of view, you will get some nice advice on doing it differently if you really want to work in a policy environment during my presentation. So what you can expect during this webinar is, before I go into 4 guiding components for trustworthy policy preparation, I will briefly explain what a science policy ecosystem is and how scientific advice works in the context of the European Parliament. And then I will show you with these 4 elements a framework for ensuring we are trustworthy in our preparation of policy advice. So the 4 steps are taking a step back to see the bigger picture, examine possible biases, and also reflect on your own biases. And a very important one is make sure that you explore any topic you work on, but this doesn't only count for scientific advice, from a wide range of perspectives, let's say 360 degrees, without overlooking important aspects. So that's the 3rd one. And the 4th one is, before you settle on a particular scientific advice, a particular policy advice or decision, to explore the possible effects of the considered courses of action. And then I will give a few further tips, and after then we will have a round of questions and answers, and then we will go to a more interactive talk about, is there something like a typical scientific advisor's profile? Because I understood that you all want to get my job and you want to learn how to get this. First of all, the first thing I would like you to do is to look at this image. So I just invite you to reflect in silence. I mean, silence, we are all in kind of quarantine, so it's not shared at all, but how this car could end up there. So just think about this. We come back on this later. So I promised to give first an idea of what the science policy ecosystem is. And therefore, it's important to understand what kind of topics come up where a scientific advice can come in. So there are a lot of policy issues where we can get involved in as scientific advisors, such as how to deal with plastic pollution. I took it as an example later in the slides. Then how can electric steps be managed in public space? I'm not sure if they are allowed in Cambridge so far, but in Brussels they can be a kind of terror. There is a lack of regulation. So is there an advice that we can give to policymakers? Then a more serious thing is, can we prepare for a rise in the sea level with the climate change? And if so, how? These are all hypothetical issues, so we are not dealing with all of these. What are challenges for genetic engineering techniques? Such as CRISPR and so on for agriculture, for human health. And then one which is ongoing at this moment is 5G safe for health as well as regarding security? And what are the benefits? So these are typical questions that scientific advisors deal with. So the science policy ecosystem, if we look into the science policy interface, a lot of policy issues really require to understand the evidence behind the issue. And this means that a science policy interface is required. But what is a science policy interface? What I mean with the science policy interface is the flow of knowledge from scientific research to policy decisions, and that's characteristic of evidence-based policymaking. So evidence-based policymaking or evidence-informed policymaking is basically the key in the role of scientific advising for policymaking. So this slide shows the simplest form of a science policy interface. It's a linear model which represents the flow of knowledge from a scientist to a politician. We used to have at European Parliament we still have it, a science member pairing scheme. And this was our former chair, Paul Rubig. And he was a big fan of this scheme, which linked top scientists with policymakers. So they formed like a team of 2 or sometimes of 3. And they could work on a typical topic of policymaking, for instance, practical problems with water management in a certain country and so on, and then have a scientist visiting the parliament for a few days, but also the member visiting the scientist and their environment at university. This was just one example. So when we speak about this famous simple scheme, oops, now I'm too far. This simple scheme with a scientist talking to a policymaker, you can risk to have a very strictly evidence-based policy. So this can be very technocratic. What we have when we do not involve scientists at all, then we risk to have not evidence-based policy, which you can call populist or whatever, where you purely base upon what the society would like to have. And what we want to reach in an evidence-based or evidence-informed policy is that there is a good balance between the evidence and the societal context in the policy making. So this is what's all about this evening. So we come from this simple science policy interface, but there are many roles by which scientists can engage with policy and politics. And there is a key role for independent and then ideally independent scientific advisors for knowledge exchange between science and policy. However, there are many roles by which scientists can engage with policy and politics. So there is a key role for independent advisors to do so, and we need more than a pure linear relationship between scientist and policy. So to ensure scientific advice is impartial and trustworthy, can we ensure that we include other players than only the scientists and the policy making, so everyone in between? Which stakeholders can be relevant? So basically, we have this for everything. We have to see the full picture. We always have the scientific basis. We have the concerns of the various stakeholders in the broader society, and we have the choices for the future, which have to be made by policymakers. So how do they know they make the best decision? So it's our role as advisors to help them. So considering that the act of policy is about making choices for the future. So that's the key thing. I have to give one clarification about terminology, which is about technology assessment and scientific foresight in the policy making. And scientific foresight comes in when we really want to give future-proof advice for the members. So technology assessment is the study, it's like it's on the slide exactly, it's a study and assessment of the effects or the impact of new technology on society. Scientific foresight is technology assessment with a focus on the future. It's including the capacity to be prepared for what could happen or be needed in the future. And when we speak about the future, we do not speak about tomorrow. We don't speak about the next year. We really think about the next 5 years and even the next generation. So it's really very broad. So I promised you to give 4 tips and tricks for policy advising, and I start here with this. So the 4 guiding components for trustworthy policy advice are seeing the bigger picture, exploring the biases, investigating issues from all angles, and exploring possible impacts. Before I go into the first one, which is exploring the ecosystem, this slide just represents the full scope of a policy advising process. So what you see as an advisor is you get requests. Normally you get a request. Sometimes you can give advice on your own initiative, but normally you get a request which is a policymaker with an issue to be solved, and they need to understand what they can do, what the problem is, and so on. The second one is exactly this first step, is the ecosystem. Then it's a collection of evidence. Then it's the societal context. It's the foresight phase, basically, to see what are the impacts of everything on society, what are societal views. Then it's to prepare a policy briefing with policy options and to communicate this in the parliament. I will touch most of these a bit less on the evidence, because that's the most obvious part for scientists to do, and the rest is what's specific for scientific advisors. So a first condition to establish trust is basically to maintain transparent procedures. And this is why I want really to go through these 4 topics later. But when I spoke about this triangle, we have these multiple players in society. And the science policy ecosystem is basically everything. It's all the scientific community and academics, experts which are relevant for a policy issue, the policymakers who have to know how to make the best decisions, and then society. And what's in this societal part? It's, of course, again, the academic community, because you're part of society. Media are playing an important role. So everyone who has certain concerns on the issue. So interest groups, it can be environmental activists, but it can also be civil society organizations, NGOs, and so on. Individual citizens, scientific advisors, policy, and I miss industry. So basically, interest groups can be related to religions, cultures, but also lobby, NGOs, name it. And the media, as I said, is important. It's not only mainstream media, it's also social media. So how can you see the bigger picture, that we in the end come to this first point? maybe you know this image of the blind man looking at the elephant with what they see or feel. And it's just to show you that the bigger picture is something different. If you focus on a file, you really have to explore the scope of a topic from a wider standpoint by getting back. So how to do it is, first of all, to investigate. So you get this question, you have this process where the first step was someone comes up with an issue and you have to understand what the issue is about. So this means that you have to try to see the full picture about the topic, but also about how this issue is related to society. I will come back later on an example with plastic. For instance, you have to understand when someone speaks about plastic, what they mean with plastic pollution, for instance, but also how important plastic is in all the actors in society. So how we do this? If I would ask if someone is an expert in systems analysis, I have no clue. I cannot see the chat if I ask a question. But when I asked this before, I never found someone in the audience who was an expert in systems analysis. So I make it very simple. A systems analysis, basically, you can conduct around with friends, with colleagues, simply by asking the following 6 questions. That's who, what, where, when, why, and how. And you do this over and over. And this means that you then understand the system, which is systems analysis basically is a technique that breaks down a system into its component pieces. So for the purpose of studying how well these component parts work and interact to accomplish their purpose. So in the system of the plastic pollution, for instance, you have the consumers who use plastics. I just read, it was in my newspaper today, an article about the plastic industry, the packaging industry, which is booming due to the lockdown. Because here, I don't know, in UK, but the shops are closed here, so everyone orders everything online, and plastic has a low weight and so on. So plastic industry is part of the ecosystem, packaging industry, but also the consumers, because they order a lot, which has to be sent in a pack, and often plastic is used. So to understand, really, to make a narrative of a topic, to really see the bigger picture, these 6 questions are very easy. You can use the mnemonic 5 whiskeys and a hangover to recall that these are 5 questions and a how. So it's an adequate way for getting the broader picture of the issue you're going to investigate for policy purposes. And it does not only help you to detail your topic, but also to make a rough stakeholders analysis. And then you can list everyone involved. You can list all actors, stakeholders, those who influence the topic, those who are affected by the issue, including interest groups, pressure groups, industry, consumers, academics, and so on. So this phase is quite important before you start any task, because this helps you to get the broader picture. So this 6 key questions for getting the bigger picture, I quickly apply them on plastic pollution. I think it will be small to read, but I quickly explain. So imagine that you get, as a newcomer in scientific advice, a question that you have to make a briefing on plastic pollution for a member of a parliament. First question is, for instance, is it about who produces it? The who question. Who produces the waste? How and why? The industry, consumers, NGOs, future generations. What is the role of policymakers? And so on. What is it? It can be microplastics, macro debris, single-use plastics. It can be, maybe it's about, maybe the requester had biodegradability of plastics in mind, or plastic recyclings. What is recyclable? How does it happen, the recycling? How do we trace plastic waste, and so on? These are all issues which can be can get on the policy table. Why plastic is used? What about the toxics also in plastic emitted, for instance, when they are incinerated? Plastics in the context of biodiversity, you name it, and you will find it with these questions. So it's about product life cycles, it's about production, it's about consumption, it's about substitutions of plastic. So by these questions, you get quickly a very high picture. There is also one important issue in this plastic when you use it as packaging for food, for instance. There are, plastic is used for food for a lot of reasons of hygiene. So for instance, what are the hygiene compliance requirements when plastic packaging of fresh food is replaced with alternatives? Or what about endocrine disruption caused by plastics? So you can go to a lot of areas of policy. It's not only about industry, it's not only about consumers, it's about health, it's about research and development, about a lot of things. Even about developing countries, because some waste is transported for recycling to third countries, and we often don't know what's actually happening with it. So this was an idea on how to get a broader picture, and you really can get an idea of the ecosystem by this simple exercise, brainstorm with a few with a different background, and you can make a big story about this single word, plastic pollution. And constituents of policy ecosystems, of course, policymakers are always part. Scientific advisors, if you look from a scientific advisory point of view, but also the scientific community, all types of stakeholders, special interest group and media, they all have a place in the science policy ecosystem. So this was the first tip, seeing the bigger picture. The second one is on bias. So let's assume that you have a first outline of the ecosystem. You have an idea of what's the picture. You have an idea about the topic. When you know how broad the topic is, you always can go back to the policymaker, asking for your advice to your client to see where the focus is needed. And you have an idea who can be affected or who can affect the plastic pollution in this case. So what's next? The second guideline is to explore possible biases, and that's not only about everyone listed in the stakeholders, but also about yourself. So now explore possible and or known visions and investigate biases is another thing. And biases are everywhere. So we can think about the question if we can be unbiased, if we can be value-free. For instance, we all have various roles. You can work as a PhD student, you can work as an advisor, whatever, you can work as a lecturer, but you always have different roles. So you always have your own environment. You have various roles in your family, at work, in other activities, with your hobbies, in your study and professional background. So basically, you're never only a researcher, you're never only a policy advisor. And this means that you have to be aware of the multiple set of roles that you have in whatever job you do. So one element of biases and influence is that there can be a conflict between what you know as facts, but what you believe or want to believe. For instance, you can know that flying is maybe not good for the planet. Taking easily an airplane to go wherever you want, but then you might think, yeah, but it's not only me. So what does it help if it's only me who does not take flights every weekend in the time that this could happen? So now I speak about non-corona times. So it's basically all a conflict between your brain and between your heart, if I can say so. It's we know that things are not good, and still we find reasons not to do it. That's a principle of cognitive dissonance for those in public who study psychology. I see now, I realize that I forgot to do the first poll. Could you start the first one, Martin? Because I would like to know what are your backgrounds in the audience? I think, voila. So you can, of course, have more than one option, because in Cambridge, I think a lot of people do different types of studies. And so we'll let it go like 10 seconds more. Ah la la. Great. So I end the poll. Can you share the outcome, Martin?
Share now.
Voila. So this is very exceptional, because usually when I speak about scientific advice, I have a lot of people who studied political science or law. So the natural sciences as a top is really a big surprise, and engineering too. So that's very interesting. What's interesting in scientific advice, when I speak about foresight and how we work in STOA at the European Parliament, is that it's very interesting to put different disciplines together, like for instance, natural scientists and social scientists, or engineers and social scientists, because they have other ways of making assumptions. And I think our brains get wired in a different way by our studies. So that's an interesting outcome. So now I know who I have in the room, which is very good. Then, as Richard said in the introduction, that I would like to have the is that I would try to give you insight in biases. First of all, by understanding your own and others' biases, you automatically become more open-minded. This is a general thing, that you listen better. And as I already said, everyone in the ecosystem is subject to biases. Biases are not per se bad. That's very important. So it's not so that all biases should be prevented. A bias is a normal thing. For instance, if you look into, for instance, policymakers, a policymaker belongs to a political group and has certain priorities and certain engagement in their work. So such biases are not to be prevented. You belong to a certain society, to a certain religion. So there are biases which are innate, or innate is not the right word, but which are intrinsic at everyone. I get a strange thing on my screen. So, but about these biases, so I developed a scheme, as you can see, with 6 categories. If you Google about biases, you get hundreds of biases. I try to group the biases to present them in the form of this bias wheel, to have a kind of a practical tool for everyone involved in policymaking to check their own and others' people thinking on possible biases. And so, as I said, I argue really that bias awareness helps us to be more open-minded, more reflective when dealing with evidence, especially when there can be an emotion when there can be emotion-biased opinions, when working on controversial issues, such as we sometimes have to do in policy, for example, with genetic engineering, with nuclear technologies, with chemical use, with climate change. So what I did with this bias wheel is I developed a wheel with more details. I don't know if you can read it, so you will get schemes about this. So you will get this in a high resolution so that you can use it. What I did with this bias wheel is, so it's seen as a tool, and the first one is what I call research biases. These are biases which are already influencing the evidence we see, or the availability of evidence. And in the detailed bias wheel, there are, I'm just looking for a scheme to make it easier to read, but I think I've put it too far away. Sorry for that. So in the research bias, it can, for instance, be a sampling bias, publication bias. When we go to the cultural bias, there we are in another area. There it can be about an ideology, stereotype bias, confirmation bias, your in-group. An interesting one is attention bias. If you focus on an issue and you really think you have already the answer in mind, then you can have blind spots. So that's part of the attention bias. Interest bias can includes definitely also a conflict of interest. And then the availability bias is also an important one, but I think I have it in one of the next slides. So availability bias has also a knowledge bias, and then a very important one, I think in general, is an associative bias. And I have slides which go more in detail. So if we go to an associative bias, there is what I call, this is not an official name, but a romantic bias, for instance. If we have to choose with a change between summer and winter time, between then a lot of people go automatically for summertime, because summertime is associated with fun, with sun, with long evenings, with terraces, with holidays. So a romantic bias can fool us. We can take decisions which are not at all evidence-based. In Belgium, given the time region we live in, it's quite obvious for scientists that keeping summertime in winter will have very long dark mornings and cause probably more accidents in traffic in the morning. So from scientific point of view, they don't see a reason to go to summertime all the year long, because the winter time is the more natural one. But if you just ask people to react, or you would do a referendum, people react with this associative idea, summer is nice. This can also be the the natural bias is also an association bias. Everything which is natural, we automatically see as good, because unnatural we see as bad. And this could be, for instance, a reason behind the resistance to genetically modified food. So it's quite important to think about all the biases. Yes, here I have it. So the availability bias, as I said, has also, it's the media also, which give us everything. Everything we see and we read is decided basically by what's published in the media, unless we are going to search for it. But in the context of a parliament, it's also the knowledge bias is very important. If we communicate scientific advice in a way that no one understands what we mean because we are too technical, we miss the point. So all these biases are also important, not only in understanding the evidence, but also in how we speak about the evidence. Do I have another example? Yes, here the blind spot is also, if we focus on a certain issue, so tunnel vision and blind spot are very interrelated. If we focus on a certain element, for instance, on having a certain proportion of renewable energy in our energy mix, we might forget that we have renewables which are not so good for the climate, such as biomass and so on, which also have a CO2 emission and all these things. All the biases are very important if you put it in the context of the speed of thinking. You might have heard about Kahneman's, I don't know if you see anything which I show, but Kahneman's, Daniel Kahneman's wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And there's a very interesting element in it. So he describes the brain's main processes as two interacting systems. The fast system, which is for intuitive and automatic thinking, and where we quickly make use of biases, and the slow system, that's for thinking that requires attention and mental effort. So when we encounter a problem in the fast intuitive thinking, we suddenly doubt, for instance, and then our brain can switch to the slow thinking and think more carefully. So, however, Kahneman explains in his book that we are innately mentally lazy. And because of the law of the least effort, we tend to think in ways that need the least amount of energy, so we go for the fast thinking. And biases help us a lot in taking shortcuts, in going for this fast thinking. So a lot of prejudgments and emotions help us making thinking shortcuts. So the more controversial an issue is, the easier we take a shortcut and we don't take the time to really reflect and to look for all evidence. However, there is another book which I don't have on my desk. Maybe it's under my laptop to put it high enough. That's The Enigma of Reason from Sperber and Mercier. And they say, they play with this fast and slow thinking. And they say when we have time to reflect, this does not mean that we are really going to reflect carefully about the evidence. Maybe we use this time for finding more arguments to say that we are right. So there are different streams in this fast and slow thinking. But anyway, they all make in a certain way very much sense in scientific advice. Another example I have here, yeah, sorry, it's in Dutch. I fell on it at a certain point and I immediately made a screenshot of this news item. It's from more than a year ago. It was a nudging experiment on which used biases on the use of mosquito nets. So this is an example of using consciously some bias in practice. And as I read in your mission statement that you would like to influence policy, I thought to pick up this slide again and to include it in my presentation. So nudging is a concept in behavioral science to influence the behavior and decision-making of groups of individuals. And the example here with the bed nets are in malaria-affected countries, often freely distributed, and they are insecticide treated. They are meant to reduce illnesses and death from malaria. But of course, you can imagine that there are a lot of alternative uses or abuses of these nets. So you can use them for window screening, you can use them for farming activities, you can use them for chicken coops, as fish nets, as football goals, as wedding fields. So they are distributed freely and everyone says, yes, again, things to play with and so on. So they had to be used for protecting the people and especially the children when sleeping in the night. So the nudging experience was based upon seeing how to prolong the netlet life, so how to stimulate the net repair. And what I did is, and the text is here, with Jesus on the bed net, we fight malaria. Because with Jesus on the bed net, the family mothers took much better care about the maintenance. So Jesus watches over us and our children. It's a religious bias, but it helped. So this was a small scale experiment, but with really promising results, because you're not going to let someone use a bed net with Jesus on it as a football goal. So, I mean, this is just how you can use bias for manipulating, and manipulating here is not per se better. So, but biases can help you to plan and to work out concrete actions. So this was the last element for the biases. There is a full chapter in my book, and my book is available at the library of the university. So Martin took care of this. I will make a few hard copies available via the association, and I will send you all this. I will send a high resolution version of this bias scheme, and also of the next one. So the next part, so we had 2 of the 4 tricks was seeing the bigger picture, being aware of possible biases, and the third one is to investigate all issues from all angles. So to explore any topic, you start with, let's say, 360 degrees. So from the topic within the ecosystem, we scan envisioned developments or events, their possible consequences for society from a wide range of perspectives, using a scheme which we are using since about 6 years in Scientific Foresight Service at the European Parliament. And basically it looks from several lenses. It helps you, it's a multi-perspective approach, which we call STEEPED. It's a variation on STEEP and PEST, which are used by many foresighters. And this is a checklist which we developed especially for scientific advice, which specifies 7 lenses through which we look at all impacts of techno-scientific developments, thereby ensuring that we cover all areas of interest and concern. So the social aspects cover religion, ethnicity, employment situation, financial means, well-being, disabilities, habits, and so on. The technological aspects include a purpose of a technology, accessibility and efficacy of a technology, the added value, the dual use, research and innovation, challenges, and so on. The third one are the economic aspects. They cover jobs, and this means not only job creation, but also job losses. For instance, with robotics, there is always a discussion about both of these. We speak about value creation, because economy is also about turnover and added value. We speak about skill dependency in industry, about resource dependency, this is all under the economic, about infrastructure dependency, and also about affordability, for instance, of products. The fourth one is the environmental aspects, and these include resource efficiency, energy efficiency, water efficiency, recyclability, sustainability, process safety, product safety. The political and legal aspects include liability, competition, market regulations. The ethical ones cover respect for persons and for the environment. So there is, of course, a little bit of overlap, because environment also comes in the environmental E, but there is also an ethical issue on respect for environment, availability, justice, collective well-being, individual freedom. And then demographic aspects cover in our scheme age, gender, household status, education level, occupation. So that's basically everything which is in a national database about everyone. But then there is also, I developed a detailed STEEP scheme. Yes, it seems I like wheels. And the detailed STEEP scheme helps us to zoom out from the details of the techno-scientific developments to a lot of sub-questions. So basically everything which I summed up is part of this outer circle. To be sure, if you start with a topic and you want to be sure that you have investigated it from 360 degrees, if you go with a few colleagues through all these elements, I hardly can imagine that you will have, that you still will have a big blind spot. So it's really to avoid overlooking important things for policy. So all these steps are for increasing the trustworthiness, the quality of scientific advice. So it's very important that you do not focus only, for instance, on the health aspects for corona, but there are economic aspects with lockdowns. There are ethical aspects. You also lock down people, you take away their freedom. You have aspects about the environment, like less emissions because there is less traffic, but you use, as I already told, maybe more plastic for packaging and so on. So basically it's important to look over all the circles. Also demographic, when you look to corona stuff, it's not only about economic losses, but it's also what do you do with elderly people. So here the age comes in. Occupation, people are all in different circumstances, and taking this into account really can help you to already do basically a big part of the scientific advice that's really analyzing what is wrong or what can go wrong and what can go good and all these things. This slide, it's a detail, but I already explained all these things. For instance, job creation and losses are important. Access of a certain technology and so on, affordability. So it helps really to broaden insights in a topic. And it's simply an effective brainstorming tool. So it's not like something which you can compare with really strong guidelines. It's just to give you inspiration on how to analyze a topic. And this is again about the environmental issues. For instance, it's very important not to look only into a product safety when you look about, for instance, an application of a technology, but also in production safety. For instance, smartphones can maybe explode or the battery can burn, but what happens with the production of a smartphone? The resources which you need come often from conflict countries and so on. So you really have to look into every aspect. So this was about the steeped wheel. And then we come to the fourth of these tips, and that's about how to so we have explored the topic and its ecosystem in the first step. We have explored possible biases. We have explored the topic from a wide range of perspectives from 360 degrees. But what's very important is looking at impacts. It's always good to keep in mind that there are many types of impacts. It's helpful to think about to have the concept of soft impacts in mind when you speak about science and technology. I will come back to this immediately. In an intended impact and unintended impact, this is quite obvious, but also important to scan around when you look into impacts. And desirable and undesirable futures, of course, are also very important in policy context. I thought it was important to explain you a bit what we mean with soft impact. It's a concept. It's all to do with how we use a technology or an application. The concept comes from Challing Swierstra. He is a Maastricht professor, a philosopher who did a lot of research about how we deal, he's a social scientist also, and how we deal with technologies. So there is now, when there is now causal link with between the technology and its impact. For instance, if we, and I think most of us do at least one of the two, a lot of people, when they wake up, the first thing they do is to check their smartphone, and often it's also the last thing before they go to sleep. But is this caused by the smartphone as such? No, it's the way how we deal with it. That's a soft impact. So there is no real causal link. There is also no clear liability, like is it Bill Gates, Steve Jobs who were responsible for our behavior, or is it us? So it's a co-produced liability of many. It's also qualitative rather than quantitative. And for instance, a hard impact is something which can explode, something which can poisonous. That's a hard impact. A soft impact is how we use it. It has no causal link with the technology, but it's important to see how technologies influence our way of living, and therefore we have to take it into account when assessing a certain technology. We will have some examples later where you can vote. So first thing is, if we look to, if we speak about policy advice, we investigate, we assess a certain problem, and we come up with, we have some policy options in mind. How can we be sure, how can we assess the impacts of the policies? So what we can do is we have to ensure that we don't have perverse effects of a policy. For instance, there is a policy of, let us consider the smoking. At a certain point at European level, I think there was a policy discussion to cut down in the tar content of cigarettes. A perverse effect here, this is which is a soft impact, is what will people do when they are really heavy smokers and the cigarettes are less dangerous? Yeah, they will smoke more. The lights, so the light bulbs, the traditional light bulbs which we knew many years ago are taken off the market, and we have LED lights. What do? We put more lights. So there are a lot of adverse effects of certain policies. And here so the advice is to look if there are for a certain policy. If you, for instance, work on the plastic pollution, and you do it on the pollution level, and basically it's environmental policy, what you then can do is to look based upon the plastic pollution. You work on the plastic pollution, but by saying we are going to replace all the plastic bottles by glass bottles, you come to a system where you have glass bottles which will not pollute the planet, but because they are recycled or supposed to be reused or recycled. But to make a glass bottle, you need a lot of more energy than for a plastic bottle. For cleaning the glass bottles, you also need a lot of water and energy. And this energy you use for the bottles, it's also the cause of greenhouse gas emissions. So then you touch the climate policy. So a policy is never a standalone. It influences how the industry is organized. So it's always important to see to look what's the main policy area. So in this case, it was environment. However, what are associated policies? What are linked policies? So to envision, to really look a bit wider, but I will give a trick for this. I think it's already in the next slide. Voila, here you are. That's a futures wheel for exploring possible future consequences. This is a visual method to anticipate direct and indirect future consequences of a particular change or development. Where does this come from? It's the futures wheel was developed by the group behind the Millennium Studies. They did a lot of foresight and they developed, it was Jerome Glenn, if this name comes across. So Jerome Glenn is a famous foresighter and he's behind this scheme. And I think he published it, this futures wheel, and in a paper already 94 or so. So it's a quite useful tool for the assessment of cross-policy impact. And I think I already gave the examples for plastic, which I forgot I have put in this slide. So let us take the hypothetical policy options of a plastic ban. So you will decrease the plastic waste, which was the purpose. So the first circle is the primary impact, then you have secondary impact and so on. So it's basically a bit like playing chess. So you think what will happen if we do if we take a certain action. So decreasing plastic waste. Another thing is substitution by glass bottles, for instance, with a higher energy use if you think what happens when you make glass bottles. A higher CO2 emission, so you come in the area of the climate policy. What else we have? We can think about substitution by planet-friendly packaging, but then you might have to rethink production processes and so on. This means a primary impact is you probably have now new plastic in the ocean when there is a ban. Seafood might become safer for the future, but you still have the problem of eliminating existing pollution. So you can already refine your policy options you have or precise them more. I had another one, yes, food safety, so that you go for other preservation techniques. So basically you come from one policy option, and by working along these circles of primary impact, secondary impact, tertiary impact, you can already visualize a lot of the impacts, and that's another part of your report, because the reporting of scientific advisors is also about assessing the policy options. So you have to explain what's the impact of your policy options so that policymakers have a better understanding of what will happen, why to choose, so they better can explain why they choose a policy option or why they choose another one. So it's very important to argue in your advice about policy options. Another element is multiple uses of the same technology. So there are various impacts possible. For instance, imagine policy making about drones. So they can be used for humanitarian aid. They can be used for obvious things like inspecting cathedrals and so on. But they also can just be used when we are hungry. And they can be used, and here, yes, I didn't organize a poll, but they can be used, for instance, for agriculture purposes. But such a drone with a camera can also be used to control people. We have seen this in the beginning of the corona crisis in China. The drones were used to detect people who were not wearing a mouth mask and so on. But they are also being used for controlling, for instance, undeclared workers in the fruit industry, in the fruit sector, and so on. So you can use them for a lot of purposes. And originally they were more for military uses and for playing around. So now you could think for a long time about how this car ended up in this situation. I think there is a poll ready. Martin, you can launch the second poll. So how did this car end up in this situation? Can you all see the poll?
I think they can see it.
So was it a drunk driver? Did he lose control maybe due to rain? Was it a GPS issue, or was it something completely different? So I will close it. And now I'm curious if someone who said other, is it still shared? There were 8 who said something else. What did you have in mind? Can someone just take the floor? I cannot see the chat, so I cannot access the chat. So that's a bit.
So someone has suggested flooding, then subsiding of the river. Someone else has suggested that it was actually sort of placed there on purpose for some reason. So that's 2 of the 8 people.
Voilà. So it's all very funny situations. The GPS indeed was, so this is a picture taken from Twitter a long time ago, where it was, by the way, a man who ended up there, and it was a pedestrians bridge, as you can see. And it was in the beginning of the time of the TomTom, and he had put on his insurance claim that it was the fault of his GPS. Of course, there can be a big discussion around this. So there goes the next poll. Who is then responsible? Is it the driver? Is it TomTom as GPS producer? Or is it politics because they allow us to use a GPS? So let's start the poll. Do you all see what the poll is not live and the results? This is funny. You all voted on the same. This never happened before. The driver is responsible, but maybe this is because there are so many natural scientists in the room. In other groups, often I hear that it's politics because politicians allow us to use it. So there should be a kind of liability which is shared by producer, driver, and politics about use. But that's indeed depending on from which point of view. I mean, if you're a lawyer or a policy scientist, you have probably a different view. Interesting. Yes, I had these polls here. So then I want to come back to the impact, to the types of impact. So hard versus soft. So hard was the causal one. Think about something which can explode, and soft is the way we use technologies, intended versus unintended, desirable versus undesirable. About the last one, because I'm not sure I have a slide on this, it's not too scientific advisors, to policy advisors to decide what's desirable and undesirable. This is really a policy issue. This is what the policymaker will decide about. So, another poll. Is this intended or unintended? I think we will close it and share it. Can someone who said intended explain why? So as I still cannot see the chat, if there is something on the chat, Richard or Martin.
No
please.
one has said anything yet. Someone said reduce blue light on screens. So perhaps why they think it's unintended. The manufacturer wants dependence on a product for repeat business. So another reason suggesting that it's not their fault.
Yeah, this is indeed what comes up. It only the last time, because this is something I discussed since a long time, and in the beginning it was always unintended. But now people think that we are made like addict to the products to buy more of the tools and the software. The next one, I think I have some more. Yeah, hard or soft? You already gave kind of an answer. I think it's yeah, voilà, that's okay. So hard, soft, or both, or if you don't know, I know it's a bit tricky, and there is not a good or a bad answer. It's just very interesting to reflect on what is hard, what is soft, what is intended, what is unintended. It's important when you deal with scientific advice or policy to really understand what is happening or what causes certain situations. So I will close this one. So soft impacts. Yeah, of course, the result is a hard one, at least for this guy. But it has to do with if you see the GPS and the driver is responsible, this is the most plausible connection. And then, wait, this was intended and unintended. And then hard or soft, that's, I mean, you may restart it. No, this was hard or soft. This is again intended, unintended. So I think it was the poll 4. Yes. So I think it is a good exercise to think about it, and it's indeed not an obvious question. It's not obvious to say if it's hard or soft. There will be elements of both in it, but it's always interesting to take the time to look if there are side effects, because these soft impacts often are side effects of a technology. To simply reflect about it as you just did. So thank you for sharing this. So, and then there is another thing. There are wrong assumptions we can make. So we can have undesirable impacts by wrong assumptions. I will give an example here, which is an example of an unintended and undesirable impact in Mao's for pest campaign in China. So one of his policies, which was the well-known Great Leap Forward, was the eradication of species deemed to be unwanted pests. So it was flies, mosquitoes, rats, and the fourth one was sparrows. I hope this is a sparrow, because I was doubting when I put the image. Anyway, it's a nice bird. So China's entire population was mobilized by Mao's war against the sparrows. And this was very easy to do because when they brought a dead sparrow, they got like a social credit. And this happened in 58. And within a few short years, the birds had all but wiped out. And the result was catastrophic. While sparrows, so he said that sparrows had to be eradicated because they ate seeds, which were the food of people. But while the sparrows did eat a small amount of seeds, the bulk of their diet was made up of insects. With the sparrows gone, China was overrun by a plague of locusts. So entire crops were lost, and the result was that more than 20 million people had starved to death in one of the world history's most terrible famines. In the end, Mao reintroduced the sparrows which he obtained from the Soviet Union, and the situation stabilized. But this was just with one wrong assumption, that you can have undesirable, unintended effects, and undesirable in this case too. So basically, impact assessment of policy options is like a play of chess. You really have to think a step forward. It's in this futures wheel you have this, but in general, it's always think what could happen after this. It's very important when you want to give a very sound scientific advice. So we are not at the end of the presentation, but at the end of these 4 steps. So we have gone through these 4 components for which can be used really in a transparent way. So first is exploring the topic and its ecosystem, make a drawing of those who are affected by the topic and who can affect the issue. Exploration of possible biases. So for the various actors and stakeholders you have identified in the previous step, explore their possible or known visions and investigate their possible biases. So scientific advisors should be as unbiased as possible in formulating for policymaker all of the policy options that the scientific and societal evidence support. I already said we have all various roles, but you have to be aware of these biases and be aware of the role you have and the responsibility you have as a scientific advisor. So try to be as unbiased as possible. And then the third one with the steeped wheel was exploring the topic from a wide range of perspectives, so the 360 degrees. So from the topic within the ecosystem, so it's basically already a lot what happened before. We can scan envisioned developments or events and their possible consequences by using this this blue scheme. Elaborated with sub-questions to help you to see deeper in everything. And then the fourth one was assessing possible decisions on possible unintended impacts, for instance, on other policy areas. By doing so in a systemic way, because everything is around system thinking. So nothing is isolated. So every policy issue, every scientific issue is basically part of an overall system. So by doing, by exploring these impacts in a systemic way, we can avoid unpleasant surprises, such as perverse effects, for instance, of a policy. Let me take the example of the policy to promote biofuel. This has led to a change of land use, which made food prices become volatile. So biofuel was promoted for as a follow-up of the Kyoto Protocol, so to cut down the CO2 emissions. And in the end, adaptations to the biofuel policy were required because the land use caused the food prices going up, especially in developing countries. And maybe this could have been prevented by a cross-policy impact assessment before the policy was proposed. And I think it's more and more done. So I don't think these days such overlook still could easily happen in, at least not in the European structures, because we have bit by bit, we we implement more impact assessment in everything at the Commission and at the European Parliament. So this was for these 4 steps. And what is then responsible scientific advice for policy is basically, I mean, scientific foresight. It's to really balance between the pure evidence, the societal opinion, with a focus on the future. And foresight is not about, as I already said, it's not about predicting. I think I already said, it's about minimizing surprise. It's about really trying to get the picture of what could be needed in the future, what could happen. So it's basically to avoid bad surprises and to make policy options much more future-proof. Let me come back on what I already showed before. So the scientific advising process starts with the request, which is a policy issue, the ecosystem for which you can use the steps, all these 4 steps, the evidence, which is, I call it here technical horizon scanning about the topic. And this is something which I think is already in your area of expertise, in the way you study and you work. And then the societal context, so the stakeholders' input. A policy briefing, which is a collection of options which then are assessed, and then it comes to communication. I have some further tips on the communication, but I think I still have a slide. Yes, I have a slide with an example. A case where I'm quite proud about, which we did at the European Parliament, it's now 5 years ago, is the foresight-based scientific advice we gave in the case of robotics. It was on the ethics of cyber-physical systems. It's a quite technical name, but basically it was on the ethics of robotics and artificial intelligence. And we based this scientific advice on a technology assessment study to understand the evidence. We involved stakeholders to understand the hopes and fears about robotics and AI in society. We had many debates in the European Parliament in a specific committee, which was in which several committees were involved. So it was not only the Industry and Research Committee, it was also the Energy Committee, the Environment, Transport. There were a lot of committees involved because they all saw issues which were important for them. And then the outcome, so Marie Delvaux was the member who was who was the rapporteur of this file. So the outcome was all about liability. Who is responsible? Let me first tell something about Marie Delvaux. Marie Delvaux was a Luxembourgish socialist member of the parliament, and she also included, for instance, the idea of, in her original report, of taxing robots on added value. Because we will speak about profiles later, she was originally an English teacher, but she had a lot of interest in history, and what was very strong in the way that she always explained everything on robotics was that she made a lot of analogies. For instance, she was very interested in the Roman time with the slaves, and she explained the way robots could dominate our life by comparing them with the slaves for the Romans and so on. So she had a lot of ways to explain what was the real problem with robots and what were the things that we could count on. But the final outcome was that there was a resolution of the parliament on the future of robotics, and it went much further than science and technology. It was about robots and AI touching the whole society. What with the future of work, what with liability. For instance, who is responsible in case of an accident with a self-driving car? Are it the developers, the engineers, the producer, the owner, the user, or again the policymaker for allowing it to be used, and so on. So this is just one. Yeah, it's not just an example. It was one of our flagships. To end this round with the 4 steps, but I promised to give you some further tips. The first one is that when you end up a scientific advisory process with policy options, you always have to be aware, and this book I have here is this is basically the title of a book, but it's on policy instruments and their evaluation, and the book is written by 3 authors. One is a policymaker, one is a policy advisor, and the other one is a public administrator. And it's very interesting to have their 3 points of view reflected. And they analyze 3 different types of policy instruments, which they call carrots, sticks, and sermons, that is in economic incentives, regulations, and information, as alternative ways to reach the same policy goal. So for every policy goal, there is not a one solution. There are always different options. So within the policy options, you still have options for concrete measures for implementing a policy. So that's one thing I want to give to you. The other one, the book is with someone at the other side. I think for the moment, I give it to Marcos, who is attending. So as this is about the role of Honnesbroeker. So as scientists, you have a choice concerning what role you should play in political debates and policy formations. So particularly in terms on how you as a scientist present your research or your advice. And this book by Roger Pilke is basically about understanding the choice you make yourself, which considerations are important to think about deciding, and the consequence of the choices for the scientist and the broader scientific enterprise. So as a scientist, do you give recommendations? Do you give options? So a very nice thing I find he gives in his book is he explains that policy is a decision, politics is something different. That's bargaining, negotiating, compromising to shape the decisions of policy. And science is the systemic hunt of knowledge. So Honnesbroeker, in the end, is a scientific advisor giving recommendations while providing a full range of policy options. So this is also what we aim at European Parliament. But for instance, this is also the term used as the ideal way of work by the Oxford Martin School. They are a lot involved in policy, so they prepare a lot of papers for policy. And it's always how you can give the options and recommendations together with societal impacts. Considerations about the impacts. So it's basically, you can reach this by following the steps which I explained. So it's really enlarging the scope of choices which you present, which you make available to the policymakers. So these scientists are science policy interfaces who integrate scientific knowledge with stakeholder concerns, presenting alternative course of action. This is a Honnesbroeker. So basically, for me, a Honnesbroeker is the ideal, unbiased, impartial role where you are not going to defend purely your own research, or you're not reflecting about the background or the wish of a politician, what he wants to hear. Now you give the overview, but you frame it. You tell what are the pros and cons of every options, given the impacts and what they want to reach with the policy, because the policy is always a decision for, and also to make it future-proof, to be prepared on what could happen with this policy option. So this book reads very easy. But I can share a summary which was made by one of our former trainees, a 3-page summary, I think it is. And this book also is available in the Cambridge, in the library of the university. Martin has confirmed this to me, so that's an interesting read anyway. For if you really want to go for a scientific advice career, I think this is something worth to read. It's really very easy to read. And then, yes, I have statistics. With Corona, we get, I don't know how it's in UK, but I assume it's exactly the same. We get all types of curves and statistics every day. But about statistics, there are a lot of things which can go wrong in presentation of graphs, and this is why I included it. It's also, this is a bit of amusement, I think, but for instance, you can confuse a lot of people. For instance, if you use a pie chart, where the sum is not 100% and so on, you simply go to Fox News and you find a lot of this nonsense. I mean, which message you want to give with such image? Such things also get sometimes in press. I don't have to explain this, but this one is a serious one. Omitting a baseline. So here, a baseline, you see a big difference between the blue and the red. In reality, it's only, you see, it comes, the red one is 60%, the blue one is 70%. I even don't know anymore what it was about, but if you would put this in a baseline of 0, there is only a small difference. So you can do it to manipulate. Sorry, again, to come back on this, you can do this to influence, but you can do it per accident. And if you do it per accident, you give wrong information. If you do it by purpose, it's your choice. But this is really misleading. I think I have another example. For instance, again, this is not 100%. Yeah, and then another thing, so this was on graphs. Another thing with statistics is that you have to be very careful with conclusions based on correlations. There is not always a link between correlations. Here, this is an example of the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in and number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool. So you can think there is a correlation, and some people think there is a correlation. There is a correlation indeed, but there is no causal link. So a correlation is not per se a causality. So be aware, but I think you all are, as you are, most of you are natural scientists, that you have to be very careful in making connections. And therefore, I would like to advise you, if you are not sure about communication on statistics and uncertainties, Professor Spiegelhalter is linked at the university, is part of the University of Cambridge. I have talked to him. I have seen him several times. I often watch his Twitter accounts, and he has a lot of things on, a lot of videos on YouTube where he really explains everything you have to know about statistics, and also how you can make mistakes, how you can avoid mistakes. He is really a great personality. He is the elected president of the UK Royal Statistical Society. But I think there are opportunities, because when I was in UK, I even attended a lecture he gave in London. So he speaks like everywhere. But he is, I think, it can be a very good source, because statistics uncertainties, for instance, when you give scientific advice and you don't mention uncertainties, this is a very weak point. So it's, I simply advise you for these things, try to watch what you can from him to understand what you can do better. And then I still have, just as a summary, again, this the balance between evidence and societal context. So basically what we want to do with future-based, evidence-based, future-proof evidence-based policy is to have a balance. So the foresight is on what might happen or be needed in the future. And it's balancing what we know today and what are the concerns for the future. And the policy options assessed are reflecting the evidence. So they are evidence-based and they explain the evidence-based policy in the societal context, but they help policymakers to make choices, to explain their choices, to explain why they choose for a certain option and not for another policy option. So basically, I think you in the meantime learned not only about scientific advice, but about foresight-based policy advice. And so foresight-based policy advice is not about predicting the future, but is about minimizing surprise. It's about being future-proof. So foresighters and especially policy advisors should be the trusted guardians of the policy preparation by systematically going through these 4 steps. So the broader picture with the ecosystem, the evidence and bias exploration, the exploration from all perspectives with steeped, and assessing the policy options before you really put them in an advisory report. This really can make from you as scientific advisor, as scientist in an advisory role, a trusted guardian for a policy preparation. The trustworthiness is a very important element in this policy area. So this was, yes, I see I went a bit over time. I can take questions now. Or we can, you can choose. You can ask questions on the profile of a scientific advisor or on what I told you before. So thank you anyway. Thank you already for listening. I had another slide, but thank you. So
so I think the floor is now open to questions. So you can ask any questions either related to the content just now or related to a career similar to Lieve's. So you can either ask by speaking, or you can also post your question on the Zoom chat function.
Maybe I should close the slides for seeing the shots.
Emma asks, I have a question, can I speak? Yes, you can.
Sorry, I just didn't want to interrupt anybody. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic talk. I had a question about sort of the evidence side of things. I wondered if you could comment on, as scientists, what you should do if you're presented with a situation where the evidence is lacking, and how to deal with a situation where the evidence doesn't yet exist, but you are still required to give advice on what the politicians should do in a particular situation. So the easiest example I can think of is with COVID, where we had a situation where a lot of the scientific knowledge was unknown, but yet advisors were still required to give advice on what should be done.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. This happens a lot. So when we get, you always have to be honest. So the honest broker, the honest always counts. You have to tell when the evidence is lacking, but ideally you come up with a solution. And one of the solutions is that you outsource, that you try to find experts who can collect evidence and assess it so that it's available. But you always have to be honest with this, but there are ways to work with scientists. So we have like specific ways of organizing fast contracts with experts, and then even we even then do peer reviews and so on. But in the case of COVID, by hindsight, you always can say that things could have been done differently. different, but the evidence was really changing every day. So it was like a progressing insight. And that's also very interesting because in this coronavirus crisis, there were a lot of exchanges in the public area between scientists from all over the world. But what has to be clearly known and understood also by the public is that what we know today is not what we knew a month ago or 6 months ago, and maybe we will have fun in a year about things we were completely ignorant about. But the main answer is you have to say when evidence is not available, and you have to see who you can use, who you can ask to sort out the main evidence. A very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question from the chat. Do you need to deal with external pressure, such as industry, to give a specific piece of advice?
Yes and no. We are not, scientific advisors per definition should try to be independent, but in the societal, when you sketch a societal context, it's important to look into all the views. For instance, I once did an exercise with some colleagues on plastic, and the first thing I checked was websites of industry to see what are their arguments to produce plastic. So it's important to, in the makeup of your ecosystem, to understand why are people having a certain interest pro or against a certain area. So you have to take it up in your analysis. What are the consequences and what is probable feedback? But you don't have you have to take it up in your assessment, and what's coming from the different sources is not your basic evidence. So it's your societal, it's part of evidence, part of societal context. So you have to make the balance. But in our case, we are not the questions come from policymakers, which of course can work in an industrial area or whatever, but we try to take a distance and to take a step backwards to see the full picture, including the industry. Is this an answer?
Keen for more questions. I suspect that seemed a good answer.
Everyone is celebrating the end of the lockdown.
Absolutely.
I have a question.
Martin.
So you mentioned during the talk that good policy is always the balance between evidence and societal context. But my question is whether the balance between evidence and societal context, are there usually a utilitarian consideration? Is it more like a cost-benefit analysis, or how would you, like balance between them exactly?
A cost-benefit analysis, yes, but in the sense of a societal cost. For instance, let me go also to Corona. So evidence-based, you could say immediately a lockdown, no one leaves the houses. The societal cost here is that you lock up, like in Belgium, we had big problems in elderly homes. And in the end, these people could not leave their rooms anymore. So that's a very huge societal cost. So it's the overall societal cost and benefit. It should not be per se an economic cost. So it's all the impacts. When you look in STEEPT, it's the ethical impact, environmental impact, it's societal impact. It's a balance of everything. Also acceptability, for instance, on nuclear energy, on GM techniques. It's what people see as a problem. So it's basically, we take into account the hopes and fears of citizens, of stakeholders, when we assess policy options. If we know that there is, for instance, in some countries, there is no acceptance at all for genetically modified food, then we have to ensure that people at least can select what they, if they eat genetically modified or not, based upon the labels on food. So you have to take this into account. It's hopes and fears in the overall sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure.
Any other questions?
I actually have a question. This is going to look staged, but I actually don't know the answer. I think this is a good forum to ask Lieve. So in your experience in the European Parliament, you mentioned how sometimes you do foresight studies that are going to have, I mean, they look at things that are going to only impact society in, let's say, 25, 10, 20 years time, even more. So you have a member who commissions that study. The problem is that those members obviously change with time. How do you ensure that the report that you've done and kind of all the research and the knowledge that you've generated is effectively transmitted to future generations of parliamentarians and it's not just put in a drawer and kind of no use when probably it's gonna be more relevant?
That's a very interesting question indeed. So the first thing we do is when we get a request, we check if it's really our task to do it. So we make an assessment of request. The request should not be just of the interest of one member unless it's very important, but it should make sense for the parliament and it should be linked to the parliamentary decision making. And files at European Parliament are never linked to one person. So there are criteria like, is it something for us in the case of STOA, because STOA works on strategic issues, because there are other scientific advisory services per parliamentary committee. So it should be wider than just one political file, one legislative file in a committee. And there should be a link with the European Parliamentary Policymaking. And it should be broad enough because, of course, we are limited in resources. We have a certain amount of staff and a certain budget, and we have to deal with them. So it's not so that a question just can be asked for the fun of the reading. We always do it with a purpose, and we make justification notes why a certain study is taken up. So this is always a first phase. This is with our investigation of the topic. So I explained with the sketching of the ecosystem that the first thing is to get really a view of what is the topic about, what is the context, but we also look into what is the relevance for the parliament. And then it should, normally they should be useful for a long time indeed. Yeah. Thank you. That was a very interesting question.
And a question from the chat. In the context of climate change, there seems to be a gap between the risks documented in the literature and policy to address these risks. Do you think that there is an appropriate understanding of the risk among policymakers with appropriate policy response? I can read a bit of that again if you need to.
I can see if I can read it. So a gap between the risks documented in literacy and policy to address this risk. I think there is a lot of, I can understand this if you see there is a lot available, and here we have a big knowledge center, which is the IPCC. So the Intergovernmental Climate Change Authority, but they have a lot of researchers, and they so we know that there is a lot published. There are also a lot of scientists working in other organizations on this evidence, and academics at universities who are not linked to IPCC. So there is, I try to reformulate the question. So a gap between the risks in the literature and the policy to address the risks. So we know that there are a lot of risks, but in the for the policy, it's also the balancing of what's possible. You can say if we, for instance, let me take a very extreme policy idea, hypothetically, that you say, voila, the risk is too high because if we continue like we do now, the temperature will go up with like 4 degrees and the sea level will raise with 7 meters, because this was discussed in one of the IPCC scenarios, 6 or 7 meters, which is a lot for urban areas at the coast. And then you can say we stop immediately all carbon based energy production. If you put this in the context of society, then the society collapses. So you need transition period. And I think the gap between the policy and the evidence there is the discussion on how we can manage the transition. If this is an answer.
I think so. I think we have time for one more question. It's in the chat, and this is interesting. Similar to how you mentioned matching politicians to scientists for policy reasons, do you think other public figures, such as celebrities, should have the opportunity of more regular contact with scientists for the impact they have on public perception?
That's a lovely question. Yes, because I always say, when I speak about media and social media, people, a lot of citizens are more have more trust for what their celebrities and other public figures put on their social media accounts, but we never try to reach these people. So this is. I think other public. I think this would be a great idea, but I don't. They will have a big impact on public perception. But how will we reach them? How you as scientists can reach them? Of course, I think there is a big task here, a good role for you all in the room to reach out as scientists with evidence. I think this is still not sufficiently, this still can be more done. That is that young scientists really try to speak for a general public, for the celebrities and so on, to bring the evidence outside as they have it. I think this is the best way to happen. It should not come from the political side. It should come from the scientists themselves, from motivated scientists who really want to create awareness about the real evidence, for instance, for on vaccination, on climate change, on GM, on food problems and so on. So I think there is a big role which is exclusively for groups like you and all the members of the Cambridge Association. That's a very interesting question. Yeah. Thank you.
I think now there might be some other questions. I know someone's messaging me to say that they might have more, but we've just hit 8 p.m., which is our scheduled time to close. So I think I'll just say, do you have any final words, Dr. Van Woensel, that you wanted to share with us before I wrap up?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also for my congratulations with the work you do, because I think this is very important that you as scientists think of the link with society via policy, because everything you do for policy is for society. I just want to give one practical advice, because I have a quite big LinkedIn group. If you connect with me, all my first contacts will become your second one. So I think the world of scientific advice and foresight will become more open by one click on your LinkedIn this evening. But that's I just want to wish you good luck with all this work, and good luck in your career. And if there is still something you want to know, you always can drop me a line or so. Good. Thank you very much and good luck this evening happening
Thanks a
with
lot,
the
Lieve.
first party
Thank
syndrome.
you
Be
so
careful.
much. Martin, would you like to do the wrap up actually?
I don't have anything to say, but just thanks everyone for your attention. I'm sure we learned a lot about, you know, balance between science, evidence, and bias. So really thank you again, Lieve, for really organizing this like good workshop. And I think it's very refreshing for us to learn from the European perspective, because usually only get the UK perspective. So I really thank you for taking the time to teach us on the ideas you shared.
This was with a great pleasure. It's an honor. Yeah. So good luck all.
Yeah,
thanks.
Thanks.
I will just share again our adverts for the upcoming events as we leave the rest of the talk. Yeah, oh, it actually turns up. You can see I'm on LinkedIn already, ready to connect.
Good, thank you.
But thank you, everyone. It's been really great to have you all here. Oh,
bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
So thanks again. I will leave now the room.